The Magic Mountain German. Der Zauberberg, pronounced Det Zauberberg, is a novel by Thomas Mann, first published in German in November 1924. It is widely considered to be one of the most influential works of 20th-century German literature. Paul Thomas Mann, UK. Mann, US. Mann, German pronunciation. Thomas Mann, listen, the 6th of June 1875 the 12th of August 1955, was a German novelist, short story writer, social critic, philanthropist, essayist, and the 1929 Nobel Prize in Literature laureate. His highly symbolic and ironic epic novels and novellas are noted for their insight into the psychology of the artist and the intellectual. His analysis and critique of the European and German soul used modernized versions of German and biblical stories, as well as the ideas of Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Arthur Schopenhauer. Mann started writing The Magic Mountain in 1912. It began as a much shorter narrative that comically revisited the aspects of death in Venice, a novella that he was preparing for publication. The newer work reflected his experiences and impressions during a period when his wife, who was suffering from a lung complaint, resided at Dr. Friedrich Jessen's Waldsanatorium in Davos, Switzerland for several months. In May and June 1912, Mann visited her and became acquainted with the team of doctors and patients in this cosmopolitan institution. According to Mann, in the afterword that was later included in the English translation of his novel, this stay inspired his opening chapter, Arrival. The outbreak of World War I interrupted his work on the book. The savage conflict and its aftermath led the author to undertake a major re-examination of European bourgeois society. He explored the sources of the destructiveness displayed by much of civilized humanity. He was also drawn to speculate about more general questions related to personal attitudes to life, health, illness, sexuality, and mortality. His political stance also changed during this period, from opposing the Weimar Republic to supporting it. Given this, Mann felt compelled to radically revise and expand the pre-war text before completing it in 1924. Der Zauberberg was eventually published in 2 volumes by S. Fischer Verlag in Berlin. Mann's vast composition is erudite, subtle, ambitious, but, most of all, ambiguous. Since its original publication it has been subject to a variety of critical assessments. For example, the book blends a scrupulous realism with deeper symbolic undertones. Given this complexity, each reader is obliged to interpret the significance of the pattern of events in the narrative, a task made more difficult by the author's irony. Mann was well aware of his book's elusiveness, but offered few clues about approaches to the text. He later compared it to a symphonic work orchestrated with a number of themes. In a playful commentary on the problems of interpretation, The Making of the Magic Mountain, written 25 years after the novel's original publication, he recommended that those who wished to understand it should read it twice. Summary. The narrative opens in the decade before World War I. It introduces the protagonist, Hans Castorp, the only child of a Hamburg merchant family. Following the early death of his parents, Castorp has been brought up by his grandfather and, later, by a maternal uncle named James Tienapple. Castorp is in his early 20s, about to take up a shipbuilding career in Hamburg, his hometown. Before beginning work, he undertakes a journey to visit his tubercular cousin, Joachim Ziemsen, who is seeking a cure in a sanatorium in Davos, high up in the Swiss Alps. In the opening chapter, Castorp leaves his familiar life and obligations, in what he later learns to call the flatlands, to visit the rarefied mountain air and introspective small world of the sanatorium. Castorp's departure from the sanatorium is repeatedly delayed by his failing health. What at first appears to be a minor bronchial infection with slight fever is diagnosed by the sanatorium's chief doctor and director, Hofrat NB1 Behrens, as symptoms of tuberculosis. Castorp is persuaded by Behrens to stay until his health improves. During his extended stay, Castorp meets a variety of characters, who represent a microcosm of pre-war Europe. These include Lodovico Settembrini, an Italian humanist and encyclopedist, a student of Giosuè Carducci, Leo Nafta, a Jewish Jesuit who favors communistic totalitarianism, Mynheer Peperkorn, a Dionysian Dutchman, and his romantic interest, Madame Claudia Chauchat. Castorp eventually resides at the sanatorium for 7 years. As the novel concludes, the war begins, and Castorp volunteers for the military. His possible demise upon the battlefield is portended. The Magic Mountain can be read both as a classic example of the European Bildungsroman, novel of education, or novel of formation, and as a sly parody of this genre. Many formal elements of this type of fiction are present. Like the protagonist of a typical Bildungsroman, the immature Castorp leaves his home and learns about art, culture, politics, human frailty, and love. Also embedded within this vast novel are extended reflections on the experience of time, music, nationalism, sociological issues, and changes in the natural world. Castorp's stay in the rarefied air of the Magic Mountain provides him with a panoramic view of pre-war European civilization and its discontents. Mann describes the subjective experience of serious illness and the gradual process of medical institutionalization. He also alludes to the irrational forces within the human psyche, at a time when Freudian psychoanalysis was becoming a prominent type of treatment. These themes relate to the development of Castorp's character over the time span covered by the novel. In his discussion of the work, written in English and published in The Atlantic January 1953, Mann states that, "What Hans came to understand is that one must go through the deep experience of sickness and death to arrive at a higher sanity and health." Mann acknowledged his debt to the skeptical insights of Friedrich Nietzsche concerning modern humanity, and he drew from these in creating conversations between the characters. Throughout the book the author employs the discussions among Settembrini, Nafta, and the medical staff to introduce the young Castorp to a wide spectrum of competing ideologies about responses to the Age of Enlightenment. However, whereas the classical Bildungsroman would conclude by Castorp's having become a mature member of society, with his own worldview and greater self-knowledge, The Magic Mountain ends with Castorp's becoming an anonymous conscript, one of millions, under fire on some battlefield of World War I. Connection to death in Venice. Mann wrote that he originally planned The Magic Mountain as a novella, a humorous, ironic, satirical, and satiric follow-up to Death in Venice, which he had completed in 1912. The atmosphere was to derive from the mixture of death and amusement that Mann had encountered while visiting his wife in a Swiss sanatorium. He intended to transfer to a comedic plane the fascination with death and triumph of ecstatic disorder over a life devoted to order, which he had explored in Death in Venice. The Magic Mountain contains many contrasts and parallels with the earlier novel. Gustav von Aschenbach, an established author, is matched to a young, callow engineer at the start of a regular career. The erotic allure of the beautiful Polish boy Tadzio corresponds to the Asiatic flabby Asiatisk Schlaf. Russian Madame Chauchat. The setting was shifted both geographically and symbolically. The lowlands of the Italian coastlands are contrasted to an alpine resort famed for its health-giving properties. Illness and death. The Berghoff patients suffer from some form of tuberculosis, which rules their daily routines, thoughts, and conversations of the half-lung club. The disease ends fatally for many of the patients, such as the Catholic girl Barbara Hughes, whose fear of death is heightened in a harrowing Vatican scene, and cousin Ziemson, who leaves this world like an ancient hero. The dialogues between Settembrini and Nafta examine life and death from a metaphysical perspective. Besides the deaths from fatal illness, two characters commit suicide, and finally Castorp goes off to fight in World War I, and it is implied that he will be killed on the battlefield. In the above-mentioned comment Mann writes, "What Castorp learns to fathom is that all higher health must have passed through illness and death. As Hans Castorp once says to Madame Chauchat, there are two ways to life, one is the common, direct, and brave. The other is bad, leading through death, and that is the genius way. This concept of illness and death, as a necessary passage to knowledge, health, and life, makes The Magic Mountain into a novel of initiation. Time. Closely connected to the themes of life and death is the subjective nature of time, a leitmotif that recurs throughout the book. Here the influence of Henri Bergson is evident. Thus Chapter 7, entitled, By the Ocean of Time, opens with the narrator asking rhetorically, can one tell, that is to say, narrate time, time itself, as such, for its own sake? Mann's authorial and ironic response to the question posed is, that would surely be an absurd undertaking. He compares storytelling with the act of music making, describing them as being alike in that they can only present themselves as a flowing, as a succession in time, as one thing after another. The Magic Mountain, in essence, embodies the author's meditations on the tempo of experience. The narrative is ordered chronologically but accelerates throughout the novel, so that the first 5 chapters, approximately half of the text, relate the first of Castorp's 7 years at the sanatorium in great detail. The remaining 6 years, marked by monotony and routine, are described in the last 2 chapters. This asymmetry corresponds to Castorp's own skewed perception of the passage of time. This structure reflects the protagonist's thoughts. Throughout the book, they discuss the philosophy of time and debate whether interest and novelty dispel or shorten the content of time, while monotony and emptiness hinder its passage. The characters also reflect on the problems of narration and time, about the correspondence between the length of a narrative and the duration of the events it describes. Mann also meditates upon the interrelationship between the experience of time and space, of time seeming to pass more slowly when one doesn't move in space. This aspect of the novel mirrors contemporary philosophical and scientific debates which are embodied in Heidegger's writings and Albert Einstein's theory of relativity, in which space and time are inseparable. In essence, Castorp's subtly transformed perspective on the flat lands corresponds to a movement in time. Magic and mountains. The titular reference to mountain reappears in many layers. The Berghof Sanatorium is located on a mountain, both geographically and figuratively, a separate world. The mountain also represents the opposite of Castorp's home, the sober, businesslike, flatland. The first part of the novel culminates and ends in the sanatorium's carnival feast. There, in a grotesque scene named after Walpurgis Night, the setting is transformed into the Blocksberg, where according to German tradition, witches and wizards meet in obscene revelry. This is also described in Goethe's Faust I. At this event, Castorp woos Madame Chauchat. Their subtle conversation is carried on almost wholly in French. Another topos of German literature is the Venus mountain, Venusberg, which is referred to in Richard Wagner's opera Tannhauser. This mountain is a hellish paradise, a place of lust and abandon, where time flows differently. The visitor loses all sense of time. Castorp, who planned to stay at the sanatorium for 3 weeks, does not leave the Berghof for 7 years. In general, the inhabitants of the Berghof spend their days in a mythical, distant atmosphere. The X-ray laboratory in the cellar represents the Hades of Greek mythology, where medical director Barons acts as the judge and punisher Rhadamanthys, and where Castorp is a fleeting visitor, like Odysseus. Barons compares the cousins to Castor and Pollux. Settembrini compares himself to Prometheus. Frau Storr mentions Sisyphus and Tantalus, albeit confusedly. The culmination of the second part of the novel is perhaps the still, episodic, chapter of Castorp's blizzard dream, in the novel simply called Snow. The protagonist gets into a sudden blizzard, beginning a death-bound sleep, dreaming at first of beautiful meadows with blossoms and of lovable young people at a southern seaside, then of a scene reminiscent of a grotesque event in Goethe's Faust I, the witch's kitchen, again in Goethe's Blocksberg chapter, and finally ending with a dream of extreme cruelty, the slaughtering of a child by 2 witches, priests of a classic temple. According to Mann, this represents the original and deathly destructive force of nature itself. Castorp awakens in due time, escapes from the blizzard, and returns to the Berghof. But rethinking his dreams, he concludes that, because of charity and love, man should never allow death to rule one's thoughts. Castorp soon forgets this sentence, so for him the blizzard event remains an interlude. This is the only sentence in the novel that Mann highlighted by italics. There are frequent references to Grimm's fairy tales, based on European myths. The opulent meals are compared to the magically self-laying table of table, donkey, and stick. Frau Engelhardt's quest to learn the first name of Madame Chochotte mirrors that of the queen in Rumpelstiltskin. Castorp's given name is the same as Clever Hans. Although the ending is not explicit, it is possible that Castorp dies on the battlefield. Mann leaves his fate unresolved. Mann makes use of the number 7, often believed to have magical qualities. Castorp was 7 when his parents died. He stays 7 years at the Berghof. The central Walpurgis night scene happens after 7 months. Both cousins have 7 letters in their last name. The dining hall has 7 tables. The digits of Castorp's room number 34 add up to 7, and Joachim's room is a multiple of 728 equals 7 times 4. Settembrini's name includes 7 set in Italian. Joachim keeps a thermometer in his mouth for 7 minutes, and Mynheer Peppercorn announces his suicide in a group of 7. Joachim decides to leave after a stay of 7 times 70 days, and dies at 7 o'clock. The novel itself, moreover, is divided into 7 chapters. Castorp. According to the author, the protagonist is a questing knight, the pure fool, looking for the Holy Grail in the tradition of Parzival. However, he remains pale and mediocre, representing a German bourgeois that is torn between conflicting influences capable of the highest humanistic ideals, yet at the same time prone to both stubborn Philistinism and radical ideologies. As usual, Mann chooses his protagonist's name carefully. Hans is a generic German first name, almost anonymous, but also refers to the fairy tale figure of Hans im Gluck and the Apostle Saint John, Johannes in German, the favorite disciple of Jesus, who beholds the revelation Offenbarung des Johannes in German. Castorp is the name of a historically prominent family in Mann's hometown, Lübeck, which provided at least 3 generations of mayors for the town in the era of the Renaissance. The Torp is Danish, not unexpected on the German north coast. Castorp also refers to the twins Castor and Pollux in Greek mythology, who were identified by the New Testament scholar Dennis MacDonald as models for the apostles James and John. In a way, Hans Castorp can be seen as the incorporation of the young Weimar Republic. Both humanism and radicalism, represented by Settembrini and NAFTA, try to win his favor, but Castorp is unable to decide. His body temperature is a subtle metaphor for his lack of clarity. Following Schiller's theory of fever, Castorp's temperature is 37.6 degrees Celsius (99.7 degrees Fahrenheit), which is neither healthy nor ill, but an intermediate point. Furthermore, the outside temperature in Castorp's residence is out of balance. It is either too warm or too cold and tends to extremes, e.g. snow in August, but never normal. According to Christian Kracht, Hans Castorp experienced the elevation of his temperature as lifting him to an elevated state of being. The most pronounced instances of Thomas Mann's political conversion is in the Schnee chapter. Completed in June 1923, this chapter, which forms the philosophical heart of the novel, attempts to overcome apparent contrasts and find a compromise between NAFTA's and Settembrini's positions. In the chapter, Humaniora, written in 1920, Castorp tells barons, in a discussion on medical matters, that an interest in life means an interest in death. In the Schnee chapter, Castorp comes to exactly the opposite conclusion. The basis for Castorp's contradiction can be found in the speech von Deutscher Republik, written in the previous year, in which Mann outlines his position with regards to precedence of life and humanity over death. Even though Castorp could not possibly have learned from either Nafta or Settembrini the idea that the experience of death is ultimately that of life and leads to a new appreciation of humanity, Mann was determined from at least September 1922 onwards to make this message the main point of his novel. In a letter of 4 September 1922 to Arthur Schnitzler, Mann refers to von Deutscher Republik, in which, he says, he is endeavoring to win the German middle classes over to the cause of the Republic and humanitarian concerns, and adds that his newfound passion for humanitarianism is closely related to the novel on which he is working. In the climax of the Schnee chapter, Castorp's vision is of the triumph of life, love and human concern over sickness and death. This realization corresponds closely to Mann's key observation in von Deutscher Republik. As if to dispel any lingering doubts, Mann makes the meaning absolutely clear in his Tischrede in Amsterdam, held on 3 May 1924. Death stands for the ultra-conservative opponents of the Republic, while life embodies the supporters of democracy, the only way to guarantee a humanitarian future. The Schnee chapter was written in the first half of 1923, and the italicization of the key sentence was probably requested by Mann when the book was set in print in 1924. As a message to the readers of the time, who, after years of hyperinflation and political turmoil, not only expected but also desperately needed a positive direction to their lives, some words of wisdom which would give them hope. Settembrini represents the active and positive ideal of the Enlightenment, of humanism, democracy, tolerance and human rights. He often finds Castorp literally in the dark and switches on the light before their conversations. He compares himself to Prometheus of Greek mythology, who brought fire and enlightenment to man. His own mentor Giosu Carducci has even written a hymn to another lightbringer, Lucifer, La Forza Vindice della Ragione. His ethics are based on bourgeois values and labor. He tries to counter Castorp's morbid fascination with death and disease, warns him against the ill Madame Chauchat, and tries to demonstrate a positive outlook on life. His antagonist Nafta describes him as Zivilisationsleiterat, meaning cosmopolitan, un-German intellectuals. Mann originally constructed Settembrini as a caricature of the liberal democratic novelist represented, for example, by his own brother Heinrich Mann. However, while the novel was being written, Mann himself became an outspoken supporter of the Weimar Republic, precipitated by the assassination of then-German Foreign Minister Walther Rathenau, whom Mann deeply admired, which may explain why Settembrini, especially in the later chapters, becomes the Sprachrohr des Autoren, the voice of the author. Settembrini's physical characteristics are reminiscent of the Italian composer Ruggero Leoncavallo. Claudia Chauchat represents erotic temptation, lust, and love, all in a degenerate, morbid, Asiatic flabby form. She is one of the major reasons for Castorp's extended stay on the Magic Mountain. The female promise of sensual pleasure as hindrance to male zest for action imitates the themes from the Circe mythos and in the nymphs in Wagner's Venus Mountain. Chauchat's feline characteristics are noted often. Her last name is derived from the French Chaude Chat, Eng, hot cat, and her first name includes the English claw. Her name may also be a reference to the Chauchat machine gun, a French weapon that saw significant use by the French and American forces during World War I. Chaude Chat could also be a play on words with chaude hot and shot female genitalia in French slang. Claudia Chauchat leaves the Berghof for some time, but she returns with an impressive companion, Mynheer Peperkorn, who suffers from a tropical disease. Mynheer Peperkorn, Claudia Chauchat's new lover, enters the Berghof scenery rather late, but he is certainly one of the most commanding persons of the novel. His behavior and personality, with its flavor of importance, combined with obvious awkwardness and the strange inability ever to complete a statement, is reminiscent of certain figures in former novellas of the author, e.g. Herr Cloderjohn and Tristan figures, which are, on the one hand, admired because of their vital energy, and, on the other hand, condemned because of their naivete. In total, this person represents the grotesqueness of a Dionysian character. The Greek god Dionysus is also Important in Nietzschean philosophy, whose The Birth of Tragedy is the source of the title The Magic Mountain. Peppercorn ends his life by suicide, also performed in a strange manner. Mynheer Peppercorn is used by the author to personify his rival, the influential German poet Gerhard Hauptmann, and even certain properties of Goethe with whom Hauptmann often was compared. Joachim Ziemßen, Hans Castorp's cousin, is described as a young person representing the ideals of loyalty and faithfulness as an officer. As already mentioned, Dr. Behrens alludes to the pair as Castor P and Pollux, the twin brothers of the Greek mythology. And in fact, there is some affinity between the two cousins, both in their love to Russian women Claudia Chauchat in the case of Hans Castorp, the female co-patient, Marusha, in the case of Joachim Ziemßen, and also in their ideals. But, in contrast to Hans Castorp, who is an assertive person on the Berghof scene, Joachim Ziemßen is rather shy, known to stand somehow outside of the community. He tries to escape from what he, unspokenly, feels to be a morbid atmosphere. After long discussions with his cousin, and in spite of being warned by Dr. Behrens, he returns to the flatlands, where he fulfills his military duties for some time. But after a while, forced by deterioration of his lungs, he returns to the Berghof. It is, however, too late for a successful treatment of his illness, and he dies in the sanitarium. His death is described in a moving chapter of the novel, with the title, As a Soldier, and a good one, Ich sterb als Soldat und brav, again a well-known citation from Goethe's Faust.